Hi everyone, welcome back to the course. We're on the second part of Module 7. The first part was environmental economics, and we saw how environmental economics starts from the neoclassical economic framework, finds some market failures, and then designs ways to try and correct the market failures. A large part of environmental economics ideas are not even necessarily about market failures, though. They're about incomplete markets. What did that mean? There's not enough private property. Those grazing lands, for example, should be made to private property according to environmental economists. Then there would be an incentive for the owner of that property not to overuse that grazing land. So environmental economists are very much in the business of creating more private property that's tradable, and that is making the market economy larger, from the assumption that Homo economicus will then maximize well-being through the growth of the market. So growth of the market is very important. We saw environmental economists tend to believe the environmental Kuznets curve that says as economic growth happens at first, it's dirty for the environment, it's bad for the environment, but then it actually improves for the environment, and a way, therefore, to get to a clean environment is through economic growth. And we also saw how environmental economists rely on the idea of technology, that the gains, the way to get a clean and economy that grows at the same time is through technological change, more efficient growth. With every unit of GDP, every dollar of GDP, you are therefore polluting less than maybe you would have 100 years ago. Why? New technologies, cleaner resources, and especially maybe clean energy. But now we're going to switch to the second part of this module, and this will be on ecological economics. And yes, it is easy to mix those up because they're very similar names, but they actually start from very different premises, and we will go through that as far as ecological economics is concerned now. So, what is ecological economics, and how is it different from environmental economics? Well, first of all, ecological economics does not begin with neoclassical economics. So, all those things you associate with neoclassical economics, especially Homo economicus, the greed of humans, and the natural adjusting of the market to make sure that that greed is transformed into social good, that's not the place where ecological economists begin. We actually begin with thermodynamics and models of the economy as being embedded within ecosystems and being embedded within society. How do they get those ideas to start with? They look at the world around them and see, well, how do studies find that humans, for example, really act? What is an economy and what is fueling the economy according to research? You see, they're not starting from sort of this micro atom of Homo economicus and building a conceptual model that's theoretical and then applying that to the world. They're more doing an inductive thing. They're looking at the world and creating their theories about how the world works from that observation. Okay, so from that, ecological economists don't tend to assume that private property or technology are silver bullets that will solve environmental problems. You really see that with environmental economists that, okay, if we just make everything into private property, the tragedy of the commons, for example, will be averted. We won't have environmental damage anymore. And then you also see, well, we don't know how we're going to stop the environmental problems really, but we just assume technology will automatically kind of solve environmental problems. Ecological economists don't really agree with that, any of these premises. They note much research that finds that common pool resources, the commons, have been effectively managed as common property, not as private property, in sustainable ways for hundreds, even hundreds of thousands of years by human society. There's no reason that private property is really in the actual world. When you look at research on resource management, private property doesn't seem to be any better than common property as far as environmental outcomes are concerned anyway. So the tragedy of the commons doesn't really hold because humans develop natural numerous institutions to protect that resource. In history, that's what we have seen according to ecological economists. Also, they note that technology, if you look through history, has tended to damage the environment even more than it has protected it. So it's quite a leap of faith to believe that technology will just solve environmental problems on its own. Ecological economists also do not prioritize economic growth, and this is a big one. It actually rejects that growth will eventually lead to environmental damage, so they are rejecting that environmental Kuznets curve. And that leads them often to a position of degrowth, or what should probably be more accurately stated, a growth agnostic position, that what we want isn't necessarily economic growth, we just want better welfare and a sustainable economy going forward. So here is the model of the economy for ecological economists. And you will remember the middle part of this from the beginning of the course. And actually, we've seen this picture before in the beginning of the course. This is the standard economic model that you get in a standard intro to economics course. The economic system is on its own, kind of floating, disconnected from anything else, including the earth and including society. And inside are households and firms, and they just circulate money between them and through the finding of new technologies. There, that tech idea is again, in new efficiencies, and efficiencies are kind of a form of technology. Technology slowly grows this economy, grows this economy, grows this economy, and that's the extent of the neoclassical economic model, essentially. Ecological economists really look at the natural sciences, theories of thermodynamics, etc., and also the social sciences, theories of political science and sociology, and they will place the ecosystem within those two systems. So here's the example of the ecosystem being replaced in the physical world. Sorry, not the ecosystem, the economic system being placed in the physical world. And they really note this is important here. This whole system is powered by the sun. All energy on Earth comes from the sun. So we know that systems, especially economic systems, require energy, whether that comes from fossil fuels or renewable resources or whatever other form. They require energy to operate. So solar energy comes in and goes into matter. That energy is transformed and by society. Society would be here if we had it, but and put into an economic system. And matter of the earth is also an input into that economic system. So already you see a kind of more realistic model where the economic system is drawing on energy and material inputs like resources to power it. Then at the other side, of course, the economy produces waste. It's either wasted heat or low-grade thermal energy that's not really reusable, or degraded matter, in other words, garbage. And that's the ecological economists' model. So they don't separate the economy from the environment. And they kind of realize the physical models of the earth, the physical realities of the earth, of what powers an economy and where the garbage goes, essentially. So how do ecological economists critique the environmental Kuznets curve? So let's take a look at that curve again. Looks like that, right? Here we have lower levels of development societies or poorer societies, and then as this is economic growth increasing, as you go along this x-axis. So as economic growth increases, environmental damage increases, environmental damage increases. This red line is all environmental damage until you get to high industrial societies. Then something magical happens here. There's a turning point, and the ecological damage is less and less and less as you get economic growth. So your economic growth would be increasing like this, and presumably while you have an increase in economic growth, environmental impact of your entire society will be declining. And the magic ingredient here, of course, is technology, whether that technology is a physical technology like electric cars or renewable energy, or whether that technology is just a more efficient policy regime, or people just caring more. We'll call those all kinds of social or technological technologies. Whether it's any of those, whatever the reason, eventually as economic growth happens, environmental damage actually decreases according to the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis. Okay, but one of the critiques of this is it has been seen in literature, the impacts that look like this, but you have to sort of bake the data in a particular way to make it happen. What do you have to do? You have to only look at production in a country. So if you're talking the United States of America, for example, to get an environmental Kuznets curve with actual data that looks like that, you will have to only focus on the impact of goods that are produced in the United States. The trick here is the population of the United States does not consume goods that are only produced in the United States. As a matter of fact, most of the goods that that population consumes are built and produced outside of that country. So the impacts of production of the goods that are used in the United States actually doesn't occur in the United States. And once you take that into account, you do not get anything even close to a reduction of environmental impact with economic growth. As a matter of fact, so when you start looking at the consumption, the impacts of consumption of people in a country, what you start to get to is the adding up of an environmental footprint. And an environmental footprint is just how much ecological damage happens from the economic activity of one citizen of a country, right? So the average citizen, how much environmental damage do they inflict on the world? And you can really see this in this map where the damage is. Canada and the United States really jump out here as the most polluting areas of the world. Those are also the most advanced economies in the world, the highest GDPs, more or less. Europe also produces pollution and environmental damage at a very high level, although not as high as Canada and the United States. That might be geographical. It's a lot more dense, easier to take trains, and a lot more public transit, therefore. And maybe they're a little bit more advanced as far as renewables are concerned. So it's a little bit less, but still they're amongst the highest environmental impacts per person in the world. So you can see as you get richer, certainly it looks like your environmental impact is higher. And you can see that also by looking at the poorer parts of the world. Here is Africa. Well, look at that. The environmental impact of the average African is much, much lower than it is in some of these wealthy countries. You can actually see environmental impact tending to increase here just along with national income. As a country has a higher per capita national income, higher people are making more money, they impact the environment more. And we haven't really seen a Kuznets curve type change away from that. China as well doesn't really impact the environment very much compared to North America or Australia or things like that, countries like that. So we can see China's somewhere in the middle, which is kind of where they are as far as GDP per capita is concerned. We have no evidence when we look at environmental footprints that there is anything like an environmental Kuznets curve going on. This is what ecological economists point to. Here's the world ecological footprint, so the average person in the world. impacts the environment in this amount. And of course, this is 1961 to 2014, a period in which the economy of the world has fairly steadily grown. And as you can see, environmental impacts in the world have fairly steadily grown. There is no dipping of impacts as our world economy has gotten richer. It has just gotten more impactful and more impactful environmentally. So no environmental Kuznets curve when you look at aggregated international data either. So these are the types of things that ecological economists point at, saying, well, we're not too sure about those environmental economists and their kind of core claims. They don't seem to add up. What environmental economists claim essentially with the environmental Kuznets curve is that there will be a thing called absolute decoupling. When it's absolute decoupling, GDP goes up and environmental damage does not, or preferably even it's reduced. That means that GDP thing and that environmental damage thing, they're not really related, and if they are, it's a negative relation. The more GDP growth will result in less environmental damage. That's what is required for an environmental Kuznets curve to hold true, absolute decoupling. There's another term, relative decoupling. That is, as GDP goes up, there's still environmental damage, and that still goes up. It just doesn't go up as much as it might have 10 years ago with each increase in GDP. And those are important distinctions for ecological economists. And now let's look at some pictures to get a better idea. This is raw material consumption. Natural resources taken from the environment, essentially. How much raw material is extracted from the environment in order to power the economy, to do the things that it's doing, okay? Here is gross domestic product in purple, and how many raw materials are extracted from the environment. And if you know anything about the environment, you know that extracting raw materials, using raw materials, causes a lot of environmental damage. And as you'll see here, the material intensity, how much material it's required to make economic growth, and this would include oil, which is an energy material, it hasn't decoupled at all. As GDP goes up, so does our environmental damage, essentially, in the extraction of raw materials. And you can see even if GDP dips, so does the environmental damage. It is almost as if GDP equals environmental damage. If you have GDP per capita increase, that will equal that an equal increase in environmental damage. You have no decoupling in this situation. This is an example of zero decoupling. If you had absolute decoupling, you would have this orange line. Suddenly, say there was absolute decoupling starting in 2001, this orange line would actually start to turn down all of a sudden and look like that environmental Kuznets curve and just sort of start to drop. That's what absolute decoupling would look like. Or it would just stay constant. That would also be absolute decoupling. But you can see here, in the real world, there has been not anything close to that. Here's another example. This is CO2 emissions. This is a thing that we've been trying to tackle through really environmental economists type policies for a long time. Many would say we haven't done enough of that. Some would say we've done too much. That's a political argument. But we know that since around the 1980s, we've discovered that we have a problem with, well, before that we discovered it, but we started to, it became more actively known about, I guess, around the 1980s, that there's an issue with CO2, issue with greenhouse gases. We have to try and have less greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So how have we done as far as that's concerned, developing technologies that would hopefully decouple our economy? You can see here there has been a change. This is the blue line here is CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere, and the red is the world GDP number that we see the world GDP here in purple. We see it here in this graph in red. So, and this is from 1960 to 2012, so a much larger frame than our previous picture. Okay, so we see, yes, GDP has gone up. We had a little financial crisis there in 2008, or a huge financial crisis, and we got through that sort of. And that's that little dip there. Now, what has our greenhouse gas emissions done, say, since the 1970s here? They've gone up. As GDP has gone up, so have our greenhouse gas emissions, or CO2, I should say, in this case. They have gone up. Have they gone up equally? No. It doesn't look like the materials economy over here that it's exactly matched. So CO2 in parts per million has not increased in lockstep to GDP. It looks here that if you get maybe a 1% increase in GDP, you'll get a 0.7% increase in CO2. So what we've achieved here would be called relative decoupling. Okay, so relative decoupling is when you have GDP increasing, you still have environmental damage here increasing, but just by not as much. We have not achieved, of course, absolute decoupling, because absolute decoupling would, again, involve this blue line of CO2 emissions to actually reverse and go down, or at least stay straight, stay constant. And that has not been achieved. Now, what we need to happen is definitely absolute decoupling. Relative decoupling does not really help us very much. And that's easy to see why if you look at this yellow line. That's the point of irreversible climate change. That's that tipping point amount of CO2 in the atmosphere that you hear in the news sometimes and on scientific reports. It's probably around 350 parts per million that tipping point of sort of irredeemable, we can't turn it back, climate change starts, right? And you can see that we've already passed that. We passed that point quite a while ago, actually. So what we need is not to slowly add more CO2 to the atmosphere, but just slowly in total. We actually have to reverse the amount of CO2 we're adding to the atmosphere, and that's just not happening. We need that absolute decoupling. So essentially, that's all fine and good. You found some efficiencies, some technologies that allow for relative decoupling, ecological economists say. However, that's not good enough. It doesn't really solve the problem of environmental damage as it's linked to GDP growth. So growth does cause environmental damage. You just can't get away from that. And so this is a point of major distinction between environmental economics and ecological economics. And it's about technology and its impact on the environment. Environmental economics suggests that technological advances will allow us to have environmentally sustainable economic growth. We'll reach this period in which we can perpetually essentially grow our economy without having an environmental impact. Ecological economists suggest, well, wait a second, we live in an ecosystem. There's only energy in and garbage out if you obey the physical laws of the universe. So therefore, as you grow the size of that human economy, no matter your technology, you're going to keep polluting the environment, and growth will always damage the environment. And as a matter of fact, some technologies, and even the ones with the best intentions of green technologies, they might even expedite and accelerate the amount of environmental damage impacted by technology. So there's no such thing as green growth or sustainable development, according to ecological economists. Technology-led economic growth, or any kind of economic growth, will lead you to destroy your planet. So we have to tackle the idea of how we design our economy and how it grows. A lot of this stems from the observations of an early neoclassical economist, William Stanley Jevons here, who was working during the Industrial Revolution and observing kind of the same stuff that Adam Smith might have been observing in the first situation when he was writing his book. And he observed that coal-saving technology during the Industrial Revolution. So in the Industrial Revolution, of course, they burned the first kind of fossil fuel that they were using was coal. And of course, when you burn that, there's a lot of CO2, a lot of pollution into the atmosphere. The epicenter of the Industrial Revolution, England, was getting pretty yucky, right? Pretty polluted. And people knew that. And there was anti kind of pollution technology developed at that point, which was more developed to save money so that producers wouldn't have to buy as much coal. Um, so there was coal saving technology. So technologies developed so that you could produce the same amount of energy with more energy, sorry, with the same amount of coal. So as these coal-saving technologies were introduced throughout industry in the Industrial Revolution, it was expected that pollution then would decrease while maintaining the industry. That's the whole idea, cleaning up the air and pollution around England. What happened? With the more efficient technology, what he saw is pollution actually got worse. And this is why it's called a paradox. So here we have another paradox, the Jevons paradox, saying as you increase efficiency through technology, even if it's trying to do a clean thing like less environmentally impactful production, as you increase that efficiency of your tech, your pollution will get worse. Why? It's often that it just spurs more economic growth, and economic growth, no matter what you do, impacts the environment. And this observation hasn't just been noted regarding coal, as it was initially by Jevons. It's been noted with energy efficient appliances during the mid 20th century and the early 21st century. More gas efficient cars have shown the same thing. As our cars get more gas efficient, we actually pollute more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of sources of this study now. So here's an example for you to wrap your head around this, because it's a paradox. It's kind of hard to understand. We see it in the data. Better, cleaner tech equals more pollution. It doesn't make sense, but this is kind of how it goes. Here's a cruise ship here. This is actually called Human Lasagna. That's the nickname for this ship because it's the largest cruise ship in the world. I think it was launched in 2025 or 2024, and it just looks like humans are stacked on it, like it's a lasagna. So that's why it's called Human Lasagna. But here's the epitome of cruise ship technology for you. And for a long time, it's been known that cruise ships are really, pound per pound, the most damaging human activity we've probably got. They're very bad for the environment. So there's been effort, especially by the cruise ship industry and engineers, to create cruise ships that are cleaner, right? And so how successful have they been with that tech? They've created much cleaner tech. If you look at this gray line at the bottom here, this gray line, that's cumulative change in cruise industry emissions intensity. So for every cruise ship passenger, essentially, how in every cruise ship, how well does it use that energy? How much environmental damage is produced in operating a cruise ship? And you can see that they've really made it more efficient. This is they've reduced environmental impacts, you could say, by around 13%. Right, and that seems to be from just between 2013 and 2017, 13%. So over 1% a year, that's pretty good. They've gotten more efficient, less environmentally damaging. But that's only the efficiency of the technology. If you add that up over the industry, you can see it spent the first few years of these technological changes just kind of not changing as far as environmental impact, and then it started to impact more. The entire cruise ship industry is impacting the environment more. Why? Well, these technological changes also involved money saving for the companies as they use less resources in order to operate their ships. If you can use less resources, that means you're a more profitable business. You're spending less on resources. If you're a more profitable business, more people, you want to expand that business. You have an economic incentive to expand that business. When you expand that business, you get more output. So efficiency, and this is an important point, efficiency, technological efficiency causes economic growth. And if you think about it, even neoclassical economic theory suggests that. Robert Solow discovered in his studies, he thought anyway, that technological change was the source of economic growth. So here you have technological change, making cruise ships more efficient, and look what you get, economic growth. And along with that economic growth, you get what this white line actually indicates is the total environmental damage is worse. And that's kind of how that Jevons paradox operates. Here's another example. Energy efficiency and increased energy use through home appliances. So here is a air conditioners. This is from 1981 to 2013. How more efficient have we made through engineering our home appliances? And you can see that a room air conditioner is 46%, was made 46% more efficient in this period. A freezer was 63%. Clothes washer, doubled its efficiency. Dishwasher, even better. Refrigerators became incredibly efficient compared to the way they were in 1981. So here is U.S. energy consumption. You'd assume that would go down if we have technology allowing for more efficient energy use. Instead, it just keeps on going up until this picture ends around 2013, a little bit before. It does have a little dip in the end here, but that is actually just because of the world financial crisis. The economy slowed down enough to dip it, and then it just sort of keeps on going up. So all of this energy efficiency of appliances does not result in reduced environmental damage. It actually results in more consumption, more efficient production, so we can produce refrigerators, for example, cheaper, and people consume more refrigerators. In 1981, the average family had one small refrigerator. Now they tend to have two refrigerators in a house, right? We've doubled our consumption because of this. Technology increases, reduces the overall price to us of the goods, which makes us buy more goods and impact the environment more. Now, of course, a lot of green, so to speak, environmental tech is focused around clean energy, and that's for good reason. Energy is this meta resource that we have that powers the entire economy, and if we can get that clean, the environmental economics argument would be we can have green growth. We can clean the economy by having just clean and hopefully cheap energy. And of course, to develop clean and cheap energy, we've been looking at things like renewable, which are clean and actually cheaper than fossil fuel energy at this point, and they keep getting cheaper and cheaper. Eventually, because of physical traits of clean energy, essentially they're next to free on the marginal level, and we know marginal costs are where industry sets their prices. So once the large fixed cost of a solar panel, for example, is invested in, the marginal cost of producing electricity is essentially zero because you just have the sun hitting that thing. Maybe you have storage costs and some upkeep costs, but not very much. So the marginal costs of producing electricity, say with solar panels, are really cheap. And that's important to understand, and we see that already in the data. So what does that mean? The price, if we have enough renewable energy in the world, the price of energy, of course, will become cheap, because if you just use the example of solar, we're just getting the free energy from the sun directly. In that case, it will make cheap energy. It's pretty tough to get energy from oil because you have to find that oil, extract it, transport it. Oil is a very inefficient energy to extract and use, right? Anyway, so that means a lot of renewables are focusing on not only being green and not impacting the environment as much per unit of energy, but also eventually being very cheap sources of energy. Now, what happens when you get a cheap source of energy? That's really important. It actually results in important shifts in both the supply and demand curve. And this is because energy is a meta resource. It's the resource that makes everything. We need energy to make every product on Earth. So if energy prices go down, the price of everything basically can go down. So if the price of everything goes down, follow that out, and you're a consumer, the price of everything goes down, that means all of a sudden you have extra money to spend on things. What do you do with that extra money? Well, you buy more things with it, don't you? So you can depict that with a shift in the demand curve here, and this is what this picture is about. Imagine this being global output. All of a sudden, energy is much more efficient and cheap. That means people have more money to spend on things because they're not spending on it on energy. The complete resource use of the world goes from Q to Q1 because you have this shift up in demand to D1. This is your new equilibrium point here. The price gets a little bit more, but your quantity goes up as well. The real story is stuff gets cheaper, people demand more, and that makes the economy grow more, and more, therefore, environmental impact happens. Also, you get a supply shift occur with low energy prices. As energy prices are lower, of course, energy is a major cost in production. As there's a major reduction in costs in production, suppliers, manufacturers, firms will take that into account, and that can be depicted in a shift to the right of the supply curve. For every amount of every price, the suppliers will be able to produce more. Why? Because their costs of production have dropped. So we depict that as a shift in the supply curve. Maybe your initial equilibrium was here at S, right? And then the supply curve shifts because of a saving of production costs because energy prices are low because you're using widespread renewables, for example. All of a sudden, you're producing more goods. So what do you have here? More efficient production, even green energy technology, but it results in increased economic growth, increase of the size of the human economy. Therefore, the efficiencies of the new tech kind of might cancel out. It might be canceled out, by the actual growth of the size of the human economy in that thermodynamic system. And all of a sudden, you have not solved the problem at all. You still are impacting humanity. The human economy is still impacting the ecology of the world in the same amount, and maybe even more. We've just got more efficient at growing our economy, which makes us more efficient at pollution. So all of this makes ecological economists really question often whether cheap, clean energy is actually good within the current economic system. The problem that we have, again, of course, is that you have cheap energy that will increase productivity. Productivity is how you get economic growth. Technology increases productivity, and that's economic growth. And then we know that economic growth is just linked to environmental damage. So that's the problem. Since energy has been found to be a main driver of economic growth, and renewables are expected to make energy much cheaper in the long run, tech alone is not effective in preventing environmental damage in a system that is designed to require an unstopping economic growth. So, take this for an example. We've seen this picture before. This is total factor productivity. This is in the United States, but you could look at any major economy and get the same picture, or global OECD, get the same basic picture. And what this is showing the great stagnation of productivity, which happened around the year, 1977. And we said we can't really tell without looking into a lot of extra literature or maybe doing more extensive studies ourselves, it's hard to tell whether this stagnation of productivity has to do with just the global institution of neoliberal policy, which did seem to reduce productivity globally, or if it has to do just with energy prices getting all of a sudden much more expensive at this exact period of time in the world and never really getting cheaper to the level that they had been before. Now, if we assume that at least some of this loss of productivity was just due to energy becoming cheaper, then what happens when you have renewables that come online after a large investment in the fixed costs of developing those renewables? What happens when they come online and start producing massive amounts of cheap, clean electricity? Well, if this equation kind of works as it has in the past, we will have Jevons paradox really kick in, and we'll have amplified extra environmental degradation paradoxically come from clean energy, and that's a problem. So what's the ecological economics answer to that problem? Don't cancel technological advancement. It's not saying that. Of course we want clean energy and green energy and all sorts of technological advancement other than that. But what we need to do is engineer an economic system that does not require constant expansion to avoid collapse. So our system now is designed to need to expand constantly. So what we have to do is engineer a new system that can manage itself at a steady state, where it doesn't have to grow economically all the time. So this brings us to one of the common themes in ecological economics, that is degrowth. It's often called degrowth, but really it's better described as being growth agnostic. The idea that you shouldn't really concentrate on growth. If growth happens, I guess that's okay, but that should not be the point of policy, and it shouldn't be what you design your economic system around. You should engineer a system instead of that to meet human needs. Okay, so the neoclassical school, Keynesians, and environmental economics are all focused on the need for sustained economic growth. You've seen that in all of their economic models. And that global neoliberal economic system is built so it will collapse if growth stalls. That's because we're not going to go into details on that, but that has a lot to do with it being built on debt. Getting people in debt to spend, getting countries in debt to spend to increase that demand that Keynes was talking about. Well, the neoliberal system has been designed so that if a country stops growing, that country will be going bankrupt real quick. You have to grow or you die. So this sort of understanding has sort of given birth to a movement called the degrowth movement that's, loosely related to ecological economics. And what they say is you focus policy and business practices on what makes people healthy and happy. That's it. Don't focus just on growth. Focus on redistribution instead of environmentally dangerous growth. And that's what's meant by degrowth. And of course, degrowth is a huge difference between ecological economics and environmental economics, because environmental economics has growth kind of baked into the model of sustainable development that it uses. Okay, so here is Kate Raworth, who is one of the more famous ecological economists, if we can call her that, in the world. And she's written a fantastic book called Donut Economics. And in her Donut Economics book, well, we have her famous donut. So let's explain the donut that is at the shape, not just, honestly, of a lot of ecological economics, but environmental economists kind of point to this thing as well as a good model. I've seen it at UN meetings. I've seen it all sorts of different places. So what does this donut say? Well, here on the outside, this green rim on the outside, that's the environmental ceiling of humanity. If we break through that ceiling, we are risking the collapse of ecosystems, and our own economic system can't, and political systems as humans can't take that force. So the safe operating space for humanity, if you're engineering a new economic system, would be in under this environmental ceiling. Just under it, of course, that implies this is the safe and just space for humanity to offer. Then you also have an interior green ring here. That's the social foundation. If you go below that social foundation, it means you're not providing people with the means to have a healthy and happy, fair, just life. And that can corrode economic and political systems and collapse them. So in order to have a sustainable kind of human system, you have to avoid exceeding this environmental ceiling and avoid going lower than the social foundation. Let's put some labels on that. Of course, the environmental ceiling, the things that you do not want to go past this are climate change. You don't want climate change to exceed its safe limits. You don't want to use too much fresh water. You don't want nitrogen and phosphorus cycles to be disrupted. Ocean acidification, you don't want chemical pollution. You don't want atmospheric aerosol. You don't want ozone depletion, biodiversity loss, and land use change. These are the things you cannot do too much of, or you threaten the sustainability of your civilization, more or less. Now, what can you have too little of, and that also threatens the viability of your civilization? Well, too little water, too low income, too low of education, resilience, that's kind of a broad thing, voice, that's a political idea, jobs, energy, social equity, gender equality, health, and food. If you don't have a minimum threshold of those things, your civilization, so to speak, would become unstable, and certainly your economy would be too. So where are we now on the donut? Doesn't look too good. The red areas are beyond the boundary. There's some gray areas where it's not sufficiently quantified yet. So clearly climate change is an obvious one at the top. We are well over the boundary of that. If we don't do something about that, we will not be in a sustainable level for civilization and society and our economy to function properly. We've overshot on nitrogen and phosphorus loading, land conversion, that's using forest land for farmland, etc., or urban land. Biodiversity loss is massive. All of these things are overshoots. So if we don't fix those, we're in big trouble. As far as shortfalls, we still have a big problem there too. Almost every category mentioned here is in shortfall. So ecological economists would look at this and say, okay, how do we engineer an economy in a political system that will allow us to function optimally within this green range in the middle? And that's sort of the goal of ecological economics. It's not trying to create markets with the wish that markets will balance everything out in an efficient way. It's trying to actually look at the system. How does it work? What are the laws of physics here? And how do we engineer something so that we stay within that green zone? So again, then we have this question, do we need economic growth in order to achieve those boundaries and not have those overshoots that we saw in the last slide? Or is economic growth even bad for that and causing a lot of those damages? And those are questions that ecological economists would study. If you'll notice, environmental economists would not even think to study that question. They wouldn't want to go there because they have sort of a belief that growth will solve the problem. Ecological economists will look at, graphs like this. This is happiness against GDP per capita. Here on the bottom axis, GDP per capita in thousands of dollars. It has PPP written there. That's purchasing power parity. That's an important figure when you see purchase power parity there. It means they've adjusted for how much it costs to buy stuff in every given country. So these national per capita GDPs are adjusted for your groceries being much less expensive in Guatemala compared to England, for example. So, and each of these dots here, that's a country. That's a country's GDP plotted against its happiness score on surveys when they survey happiness. And what do you get? Well, this is the trend line they've drawn, finding the average point of all these dots. And it's fairly clear that if you're very poor and your country has almost zero average GDP, you're not very happy. And if you get a little bit extra GDP, it goes up to 10,000 or something. Wow, you get a lot more happy. Your population becomes a lot more happy. Makes sense. You're in misery, you're in poverty, you get an extra bit of money, you're happier. So as nations become wealthier and wealthier, they do become happier, but that only happens up till around, say, $40,000 a year of GDP. In this particular PPP 2015 measure. And after that, as you can see, it kind of flatlines. If you go up to 50,000 a year, you really don't get much more happy. From 50 to 60, nope. 60 to 70, you don't get happier. 70 to 80,000, you don't get happier, and on and on and up, on and on. After you pass a certain threshold of wealth, more money doesn't make you happier as a country. Okay, well, that's just happiness. But how does it work with something kind of more meaty and substantial than happiness? Well, let's go to the big one. How long do people live in your country? This is lifespan, a similar scatter plot between income, GDP per capita on the bottom, and lifespan, life expectancy on the y-axis here, going north to south. And as you can see, if you step back, you can see the shape that these dots are making. It's the same shape as we see on this trend line in the happiness graph. It goes up at a low level of income. Yes, you have low life expectancies. As income countries have higher incomes, the life expectancy rises dramatically until you get to around, I'm not sure the exact amount, but we'll guess it's around 40,000 because it looks a lot like the other graph. A certain amount anyway, and then all of a sudden it goes flat. Above this line here, approximately where France is, maybe where Italy is and Spain, above that level of income, there is no extra impact on life expectancy. As a matter of fact, you can see here's Luxembourg. That's the second wealthiest country in the world. For example, it's much more wealthy than Japan and Spain, but it's actually a little bit lower life expectancy than Japan or Spain. And another standout example here is the United States. United States has a lot more money than a lot of other countries, but actually the life expectancy in the United States is much lower than many of the countries in the world. So certainly more money does not equate in higher life expectancy. So what do ecological economists take from this? They say, well, you don't need economic growth to make people's lives better, do you? It doesn't take more money. It just takes a change in the system. So let's look at this. And this is the argument. With justice and equity, you do not need growth or efficiency beyond the levels we have right now in the world. That's sort of an argument that's created by ecological economists. Now, it's often said that economic growth is necessary for poverty alleviation, but we actually have more than enough wealth on Earth to eradicate poverty many times over if we just distribute things better. So that's the main issue, is redistribution, or the distribution of wealth in our world. If we distributed it properly, we wouldn't need economic growth. Then we wouldn't have to rely on that thing, growth, that kills the environment. Here's some examples. This is the 1%, the wealthiest 1% of people. Their environmental impact is 48 times the average person who is in the bottom 50% of the population. So yeah, the super wealthy have massive environmental footprints between the compared with the average person on Earth. So if you erase some of the super wealth, well, they're doing a lot more polluting than we are, and you could take some of their money and you could actually get an environmental gain by redistributing that, is the argument. Ah, how is the world's wealth shared? Well, we live in a very unequal world, right? Here is almost 70% of the population controls only 30% of the, or sorry, 3% of the wealth of the world. So think about that and just let it sink in. Almost the 70, think of 70% of the population in the world, billions of people, probably about 6 billion people, I guess, something like that. They only control 3% of the wealth in the world. And you go to the other end, the wealthiest, less than 1% of the population, 0.7% of the population, control clearly 41% of all the wealth in the world, nearly half. You could estimate here, like the wealthiest 1% of the population probably control half the wealth in the world. That's a massively unequal world. Ecological economists say, well, you make that world more equal, you don't need economic growth. In order to do that, you just need to adjust the equality problem. Then you can avoid environmental damage. Okay, so they would go through and do some sort of calculations like this. Here is the average household income in selected countries. Wait, let's load the whole thing up here. This is a graph of average income in selected countries. Let's go through our other information here. First, total GDP in the world in 2025 was 113.8 trillion, basically 114 trillion. How many households were there in the world? 2.2 billion. So it's pretty easy to do that math. That means there's the average household income, if we decided to share everything equally in the world, would be about $52,000 a year. That's the average annual income. Currently, over half the households in the world live on less than $5,000 a year. So what we're doing, if we have an equal and imagining an equal world, a perfectly equal world, we're moving from a world in which half the households live on less than $5,000 a year, and those households now live on about $52,000 a year. This is an extreme example of complete imposed equality. Not possible, but we can, ecological economists would argue that we can do something in between what we have now and what we would have if we had complete equality. But if you did share all the resources in the world, all of the income in the world equally, what would you get? Certainly the point is everybody would have almost exactly the same income as Luxembourg, the second richest country in the world currently. Everybody could live like the people live in the second richest country in the world. That $52,000 a year is more. These are PPP adjusted numbers. That's why they look lower than standard GDP. But it's more than the average income in the United States. So the argument here from ecological economists is that, oh, hey, well, if we just distributed income better, we certainly wouldn't need economic growth. As a matter of fact, we'd have a world where everybody lives in a world of plenty. And therefore, we don't have to worry about health problems and longevity problems and issues like that. And we don't have to pollute the world more in order to get growth to try and alleviate poverty. That's the argument. So now, realistically, what do you do then? Those examples of how great it would be if everybody was equal in the world, those are just used as examples. Those aren't the policies. There's no ecological economics policy that says, okay, let's just make everybody equal. What that is an example of how much better we could be doing now if we wanted to, and how much room to move we actually have as a system. But how do you get there, and how do you engineer a new economic system that doesn't need growth and that promotes more equality? Well, of course, ecological economists have worked on that, and there are a group of ideas that needs to have a lot more work and a lot more specificity. Of course, it has to cut across political science and psychology, because you're talking about redesigning political and economic systems and even cultural systems at this point. So what does ecological economics usually propose, and this is not an exhaustive list. First is planned obsolescence. Cancel that. We've discussed this already. Planned obsolescence is when things are designed to break, to create more garbage, more environmental damage, and continue us buying, and that is continue growing the GDP. Cut advertising. We don't need to be convinced that we need stuff that we really don't need anymore. Shift from ownership to usership. So instead of owning things, you share them, like using robo-taxis, for example, instead of owning your own car, or just taking taxis and Ubers instead of your own car, or sharing public transit instead of your own car. There are things like tool libraries that have cropped up some places in the world. So instead of everybody buying their own tools, you need a drill for the day, just go sign it out, just like you sign out a book from a library, things like that. And food waste. We waste a lot of food. There's all sorts of detail in this that we can't get into in a course of this level and this breadth, but there's a huge problem with food waste. So if you end that, you can really do a good job on hunger without having to grow the economy more. Cap the size of destructive industries. Put a cap there on how much fossil fuel, for example, we use. Tax energy heavily, or just put quotas. Green job guarantees is an interesting idea. Have people have guaranteed jobs that are about protecting the environment. I mean, plant trees, we'll pay you to plant trees kind of jobs. And redistribution, of course, and restitution to reduce inequality. Do something about that distributive problem that we have. Decommodify public goods and expand the commons. That's another one, suggesting that actually there's a lot of literature that commons are really good because we can share resources in the commons. We can use them often more efficiently actually than private goods. So a lot of detail there. There's a lot of studies, a lot of reading to do, and a lot of future study and research to undertake about how public goods and commons are actually good for the environment. Cancel debt and fractional reserve banking. This is that thing that gets the economy addicted to growth. I mentioned before, if the economy collapses, if the economy stops growing, it will collapse. Why? Because if it stops growing, we won't be able to pay off our debts. So that would be not what we would want. And if we can't pay off our debts, then there's banking crises. The capitalist system falls apart. So we want to address that sort of impetus to growth that is debt-based economics. Promote and respect alternative indigenous knowledge. And these suggestions just come from Jason Hickel's book. You could look that up. That's a good starter book for ecological economics. There's plenty of other ideas that get a lot more detail, and you can go as sort of technical as you want on this engineering of the economy. But also, ecological economists don't just use stuff from that I've sort of divided into that term ecological economics here. They also use ideas from environmental economics, like taxation of bad industries that pollute a lot, subsidize industries that are clean, true cost accounting. That's when you actually count those externalities and try and include that in the price, maybe using carbon credits and things like that. They also look at political science and ways to redesign democracy, because you can't change and engineer an economic system without a real true democracy, is the argument. And look at how to nurture equity and participation in processes to assure that we can have a just and ecologically sustainable civilization. Ecological economists will use behavioral and institutional economics understandings. Like they might use some nudges. They say, hey, let's do nudges, or do advertising of ecological to try and change culture for ecological betterment. Try and use cooperation versus conflict techniques. Remember, neoclassical economics has conflict built into it. The idea we're all competing with one another. Well, you can actually use behavioral and institutional economics understandings to show that no, cooperation is common and probably more effective, so let's do more of that. This is a whole wide swath. There's a whole bunch of, a lot of other areas that ecological economists would suggest as policies. So let's just kind of back off and make sure that this one's clear, though. The distinction between environmental and ecological economics is really important. Okay, so I've got a little balance sheet here, so to speak, to help us distinguish. So the model of the human. How does each of these disciplines model a human? Well, environmental economics uses Homo economicus, while ecological economics would tend to use Homo sociologicus. That's what we're calling it in this course, Homo sociologicus. Human interaction. How do humans interact? Well, for environmental economists, humans tend to interact only through prices, just like with neoclassical economics. But with ecological economics, they suggest, no, humans interact multiple ways. They speak to one another, they give each other hugs, etc., etc. There's lots of ways that humans can interact that aren't just through market prices. What is the goal of environmental economics? Well, it's sustainable economic growth, or green growth, but that growth thing is in there. The goal of ecological economics is flourishing and balance, you could say. How do you reduce the environmental impact? Well, for environmental economics, it really comes down to technology. That's how you're going to reduce the environmental impact. For ecological economics, it's technology, yes, but also redistribution and degrowth, or at least being agnostic to growth. So what does sustainability require for environmental economics? It requires technological change, and if you'll remember, economic growth. It needed economic growth. For ecological economics, sustainability requires system, culture, and behavioral change. So that's a rough ready kind of dichotomy between these two schools. Now, I should back off this a bit, and this is the same as doing any taxonomy. A taxonomy is when you categorize things and say this goes into this pile, that thing goes into the other pile, and that's what we're doing in this course, right? Doing a taxonomy of ways of thinking of the economy. Well, this is a great example of this. In the real world, there are economists and other social scientists that really borrow from each of these schools quite often. So I don't want to mean this to say that you have to dogmatically say, I'm an ecological economist and I believe this, or I'm an environmental economist and I believe this. You don't have to do that. You can do what you want. You can think creatively, and this is kind of the point of this whole course. You don't have to just dogmatically believe what you get from neoclassical economics, and that's the thing. You can actually use knowledges and evidence from different ways of thinking. That's the whole idea of critical thinking. That's thinking outside of the box. That's creative thinking. That's how you do it. So you can combine these things, but I'm giving you a taxonomy of ideas here. So I hope that's helpful for the environmental versus ecological economics portion and for the whole course.